Okay, there we go. We're going to begin tonight introducing the book of Daniel and to think through this book together. And if things hold like they are, I think we can finish it by October. At least that's the goal anyway. And we'll see. We got quite a busy summer, a lot of in and out. But anyway, we can certainly make it through a good portion of it. And I'm certain we can finish it by the end of the year and then turn our attention elsewhere. So as we think about this particular book, I don't think it's any secret that the influence of Christianity at a high level of government is waning. But the question I think we need to ask ourselves is this: are we more upset that God is no longer being honored than we are the fact that we're no longer the powerful majority? That's something we really need to think about. This book of Daniel, it teaches us many things. One of the things it teaches us is how to interact with a culture that is hostile toward people of faith. And that's one of the things that we will look at as we look at these chapters, is that a lot of Christians over the last 5-6 years or so have really started to act as if the sky is falling because America is doing something that's never done before. Listen, there was a long time where Christianity was, even if it was given lip service, it was still upheld as the norm and as the standard. That day's gone. All right? And we've got to accept that. Doesn't mean that we don't try and teach the gospel and do things, but in a way, for a time, the church started to rely on government and legislation to change people rather than getting involved in the lives of people and teaching them the gospel and allowing God to change them. And so it may be a great blessing that we're forced to do what God has called us to do again. And so when we think about this particular book, one of the things about Daniel and its counterpart in the New Testament, Revelation, is that when Christians are in difficult circumstances, the two books to which they continually turn are Daniel and Revelation, because both of them are dealing with cultures that are hostile to faith and understanding how we go about dealing with that. For an example, the Qumran community, which is where one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century took place, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was an Essene community, and what it did for us is give us the oldest Old Testament manuscripts that we still have to this date. And in Qumran, there were more copies of Daniel than there were any other Hebrew book of the Bible. There were commentaries written on passages of Daniel that tells you how they viewed it. The fact that they had to have so many copies tells you that it's in demand, okay? And so they clung very closely to it. Jews during the Crusades would often preach and teach from Daniel quite a bit. Jews that were expelled from Spain in the 14th and 15th centuries would also teach from it. And so even modern-day Jews and Christians have relied upon Daniel in difficult circumstances because that's what it's about. Now, as we think about this book, I want to begin with a number of statements that have been made that I think are very important. The first of which is, in spite of all present appearances, God is in control of things. Okay? And what is meant by that is God is on his throne. He has not abdicated. He has not moved. He's still the same place he's always been. okay? For some reason, sometimes when things are happening, we have this tendency to say, well, God has never for a second lost control of a single thing. He's always been in the same place that he is, okay? And so this book, what happens is that, in times of difficulty, in times of crisis, cultural crisis, faith crisis, all these different things, is everything starts moving and shifting and sinking and rising. And one of the reasons why Daniel and Revelation are so big on the sovereignty of God, the control of God, is because in the midst of such upheaval and change, you have to find yourself anchored to something that does not change, or else you're going to go down when everything you've invested in goes down. Okay? So if we don't anchor ourselves to God, the one who does not change, the one who does not move, then eventually we're going to ride waves. And once our wave is run its course, it's going to go down, and we're going to go down with it. For an example, if we attach our hopes to a political party, you can ride that wave while your party is in power. But then you seem to despair when your party loses power. It's because you're anchored to the wrong party. You're supposed to be anchored to God. I'm supposed to be anchored to God. And there's nothing that any party can do that can sink that ship. Any of them. And so, in spite of all present appearances, and it can look in some of these circumstances, as we saw at the end of Kings, their world was rocked. Everything they had ever known was decimated. Everything was gone. Everything had sunk on them. Now what they need is to anchor themselves in the reality of who God is and how it's going to help them in this process. The next statement that's there, it says, as long as God lives and reigns, his people have hope. Christians should never fear the state, whatever government that may be. It says, the book of Daniel assures us that God has numbered the days of every wicked leader who wields power irresponsibly. Rulers may array themselves against all things godly, but he who sits on heaven's throne mocks them derisively. That's a quotation, he's alluding to Psalm 2 there, where they're trying to reject the Messiah. Probably reject David and reject the Messiah in a more New Testament context. But anyway, the point being, this book talks about the rise and fall of empires. Okay? The rise and fall of empires. And so, every wicked ruler, their days are numbered. They can't live forever. Their regime cannot last forever. People have tried that. It doesn't work. It's not going to work. And so one of the things that Daniel shows us with the rising, it's a lot of upheaval because it covers roughly most of it is covered in 400 years. Then the Roman Empire begins to kind of wane a little bit. So we're talking 400, 500, 600 years at the most. And in that time, you're going to see 4 major superpowers come to the scene. That is, politically speaking, on the global stage. 4 of them will rise and fall together. And so they're transitory. They will not last forever. All right? So as long as God is alive, God's people have hope because we've anchored ourselves in one who will not and cannot change. Now, as we progress forward and we think about this statement, it says the book of Daniel gives us instructions of how to live faithfully in a pagan world and encourages hope. One day God will turn everything upside down. These 3 key elements of the book of Daniel, realism, perseverance, and hope, provide an apt, that's supposed to say and instead of an apt summary for all of Scripture. So the point that's being made here is that God is going to right every wrong. So realism, perseverance, and hope. Realism. We have to get comfortable with the fact that the America that we once knew probably won't ever be back. That's not saying it won't. I'm saying you study empires, you study history. Christianity is probably never going to wield the influence it once had in the political realm. okay? And as long as we cling to that hope that it's going to recover, Christianity is going to gain its foothold, we can't cling to God, okay? So we have to be realistic of the situation that we're in. I mean, when we were in 2 Kings 24 and 25, one of the things Jeremiah told them was, accept captivity. It's happening. God is not going to rescue you. You are going into captivity. Accept it. Be realistic about the situation in which you find yourself. Because if we will not be realistic about the situation, we can't respond correctly. We have to be able to assess a situation and see it for what it is. And so that's why he tells us, first of all, that there has to be realism. And then once we realize what we're dealing with, then we can move and we can find ways to, God will show us ways to persevere through those difficulties as they arise. And we'll be driven by a hope that even though they may win in the moment, God is going to reverse everything. Every victory that it looks like Satan won is actually going to be turned upside down and counted as a loss at the end of the day. But we have to be willing to accept that and to realize, one of the things we're going to see here when we get into some of these stories is that, okay, for an example, Daniel 3, God rescues Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the burning fiery furnace. But if you study biblical history in the text of Scripture and in extra-biblical literature, God delivering people from persecution under special circumstances like that is the exception. It is not the rule. The majority of people of God, He allowed them to die for the cause. He allowed them to die as martyrs. The supernatural deliverance was the exception. It was not the rule. Now, obviously, if I'm standing in that situation, I'm hoping, I wish it were the rule. But it's not. And so we have to realize, and Revelation will hit on this a lot too, especially when you get to the seals in chapter 6, that you have to be willing to accept that, you know what? The people that have assaulted me for my faith in this lifetime, I'm going to die without ever seeing that made right. But that doesn't mean it's not ever going to be made right. It just means I won't ever see it. Okay? So then we move and we think this is another statement. When in exile, God's people find success in conviction, not compromise. We're to be polite and never flaunt our piety like a red sash before a raging bull. But we nonetheless endeavor always to exalt the name of the Lord at any cost. In short, the book of Daniel teaches the church how to behave while exiled in a hostile culture. That is, you find success in conviction. What's interesting is that if you look around us, a number of people are casting off their convictions, hoping that they can compromise themselves into the world's good graces. Listen, the second a church compromises convictions, it's lost its reason for existence. The church is always supposed to be countercultural. The second you start giving in to the culture, you lose your reason for existence. Look at religious groups who are compromising some of the most fundamental elements of Christian faith, and as soon as they compromise their attendance, their membership, everything, it tanks, it hits the bottom every single time. And everyone that continues to do it, they're going to experience the same thing. You have to be convictional. And we're going to find out where our convictions really are. Are we willing to hold to them? But this is the other side, and we'll have another statement here in just a moment that illustrates this. We must never flaunt our piety like a red sash before a raging bull. So there are two extremes when it comes to how you deal with culture. Some people, they go all conviction, and what they end up doing is they become what I think rightly have been called, they become Jesus jerks. You're terrible, you're awful, you're going to hell. I want you to stay as far away from me as you possibly can. The other side says, no, we'll give you every single thing you want. We'll compromise everything just to try and get along. Neither of those positions are right. Neither of them. And so this next statement really starts to drive home that point. It says, and using Daniel, he says, with humble confidence, Daniel glorified God through his actions and speech. His character and conduct stood out because it was both respectful and resolute. He didn't conform to the demands of Nebuchadnezzar and all the pagan customs of the Babylonians, and he didn't act self-righteous, judgmental, or defensive either. He simply did the right thing the right way. So this particular writer in his book, he was telling a story about how someone bought him a tailored suit, and so he goes into to this particular tailor, a very high-end tailor, to get his measurements and things so the suit can be custom made for him. And at the end, he finds out this particular man is a preacher. The man, that is, the man receiving the suit, that he's a preacher. The man who's doing the alterations is from a different country and is actually an idolater, has idols even in his shop. And when he tells him that he is a preacher, the man who has been doing these alterations and measurements is very shocked by it. And he said, because I've done this for a number of Christian people, and the only thing that they have ever tried to do from the second they meet me is to tell me why what I believe is wrong. You're the only person that has ever just talked to me and seen me as a human being. We can be, and this is something that's a hard balance to find, we can hold conviction and compassion all at the same time and treat people the way that people deserve to be treated as human beings, even people with whom we disagree. When you look at Daniel, Daniel was not a jerk. When it came to the food that he was going to eat, and we'll dive into that some next week, exactly why he didn't want the meat is not perfectly clear. There are several options, but it's not perfectly clear. But he doesn't look at the guy and go, you know what? I don't want your stinking food. He doesn't perform this public demonstration with all the other prisoners. He simply asked the person in charge, he said, look, I know you've got a job to do. Could we run a test? And could we have this for a certain amount of days and test and see if it makes us look any worse? I don't want to get you in trouble. You have a job to do. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I'm just trying to hold to my convictions. Is there a way that we can both get what we're looking for here? He holds his convictions, but he's respectful. And so many people don't understand the balance of that. And some people think that if you're respectful and if you're kind and if you don't tell people that they're wrong and the first time you meet them, that somehow you are weak and compromising. That's just not true. It's just not true. So, and we could go on and on. You could look at Daniel 3 with the three young men. They didn't organize a protest. As a matter of fact, you know how Nebuchadnezzar found out they didn't bow? Somebody saw him and told him. It wasn't like they walked up to him and said, hey, ain't happening. They simply held their conviction. That's all they did. So, he goes on to say, we can be a people who stand out because of the way we relate to others, especially those different from us. We can be people who serve those in need with a willing spirit and a gracious generosity. We can be people who reflect the loving kindness of a good God. We can be people who stand firm and love well. And I've said it a zillion times before, and I'm going to say it as long as I can. Any person who tells you or tells me you have to pick one or the other do not listen to a single thing they say. We don't choose between conviction and compassion. We marry them to each other. That's exactly who Jesus was while he was on earth. That's exactly who his people are. Compassionate and convictional, all at the same time. That's why we need Daniel now. Showing us, because there are a lot of cultural questions that are coming at us, and they're coming at us rapidly. And I'll be the first one to tell you, I don't know exactly I don't know exactly what the answers are. But I know how those answers and those convictions, whatever conclusion we come to, those two things must marry each other. We've got to find a way to hold the conviction and still be compassionate. We don't have a choice in the matter. It's what we're told to do. So, as we think about the book itself now, or the man, well, let's think about Daniel himself for just a minute and kind of get a feel for who he is. So first of all, there are three men in Scripture who are named Daniel. One is a son of David by Abigail. You remember he married her in 1 Samuel 25. Her husband was a foolish man. Then you have one of the priests in the days of Nehemiah. And then, of course, you have our Daniel. We know that he was nobility, right? We saw that in 2 Kings 20 when Hezekiah is told for his foolishness that they're going to go into captivity and his sons are going to be taken captive. There's a direct link. And, of course, the way Daniel 1 opens, verse 3, some of the nobles were taken and some of the young men who could be trained to stand and serve Nebuchadnezzar are taken. So we know that he's nobility. His father, who exactly his dad is, we don't know for certain. It's probably likely that Daniel was not in the royal line in the sense that he was going to inherit the throne, okay? He's probably in an extended, one of his grandfathers was probably king, but he's never going to be king. That seems to be a most likely thing. But his parents, okay, so Daniel is named. When you see these, some of these names like Daniel, and you see the EL ending on it, El or Elah or Elohim, that's a way of putting God in the name of the individual, okay? So you look at people like Daniel or Joel, that EL tells you that the name of God is in their name. Or Israel, okay? So Daniel literally means God is my judge, and when parents in these cultures named their children, they named them with religious expectations for them. And so Daniel's parents, what's interesting is Daniel's parents, and certainly, if not his parents, his grandparents, were probably very much influenced by Josiah's reform. When he went about restoring the temple and restoring the law, it seems like the parents of Daniel were influenced by that. And then Daniel is born, and estimations are that Daniel is 16 at the time of Daniel 1. To be honest with you, it's just a flat-out guess. I mean, he's young. He's a young man. There's no question about that. Exactly how young he is, who knows? Every culture dates youth in a different way. And so, but we'll deal with some of that as we get into it. We also know that he was never married or had children. He is made a eunuch, according to the prophecy of 2 Kings 20. Now, it is true that the term eunuch could be a little more elastic, that sometimes a eunuch was not a man who had been physically mutilated, but most of the time that is what it means. I mean, that's where the word comes from. And so, obviously, if that happens to him, I mean, he can't have children. He can't be married. The reason why a lot of these men were made eunuchs, especially, is that they guarded the female royalty. Well, you want to make sure that one of the guards doesn't have an inappropriate relationship with female royalty, make them incapable of it, okay? I'm not saying it's necessarily a good idea. I am saying it does work. So it wasn't uncommon for people who served in the courts to do that, and honestly, so they could focus all of their attention on the one thing in front of them, which was usually the king wanted their service. So he was not married or obviously didn't have children. He's referenced 2 other times, both in Ezekiel 14 to 20. He's referenced, and Ezekiel was living at the same time he was. Ezekiel 28 and verse 3. Of course, his incident with the lion's den is mentioned in Hebrews 11 and verse 33. One of the interesting things about him is that we're not told of any specific sin that Daniel ever committed. Okay? Now, we know he sinned. Daniel 9 and verse 20 says, I was confessing my sins and the sins of my people before God. We know he sinned. We're just not told it. The only other person that I can think of where we have a large database of information on them that we're not told of a sin they committed would be someone like Joseph. And Joseph and Daniel's stories are extremely intertwined and very similar to one another, and we'll see some of that develop. All right? Let's see here. His ministry. He was a prophet. He's called that by Jesus himself in Matthew 24 and verse 15 in his Olivet Discourse about the destruction of Jerusalem. He also served the Babylonian and Persian empires. We're not going to go and talk a lot. In the previous times I've taught this class, I've spent a lot of times discussing Babylon and Medo-Persia. And while I think that information is interesting to me, I don't know that it necessarily just fully enhances our understanding of the book either. But if you want to know more about them, Dr. Ed Gallagher and I have a podcast together. He's the one who does the heavy lifting. It's called Inside the Scholar's Study. And this is the first season of it. And so season 1, episode 4 is on a history of Babylon. And season 1, episode 12 is on a history of Medo-Persia. And you can learn some more about that if you want to look into it. They're about 45 minutes to an hour long each. So it's not that you don't already get enough of me. You can hear some more. But you can also hear him more. I don't talk very much in that one. It's called Inside the Scholar's Study. The scholar's not me. Matter of fact, when it started, my suggestion for the show name was The Scholar and the Simpleton. And even though I didn't get my title, I still try to live up to that every time we record. So, but he does a really good job in dealing with that. Just want to finish this out real quick so we can next week begin looking at some of the things about the book and move into chapter 1. That is that his ministry was also a Gentile audience. That makes him very peculiar. Okay? A lot of the prophets talked about Gentile nations. Few of them actually preached in Gentile nations. Jonah was one of them. Some of the others, maybe Obadiah, depending upon the date of his book and where he was, maybe. He also was contemporary with a lot of other prophets. Jeremiah was older than him, but also was continuing to preach while he was alive. Ezekiel was preaching while he was alive. As a matter of fact, mentions him twice in his book, as we've already said. Nahum, the destruction of Nineveh, most likely in his lifetime. Habakkuk, which would have been around, depending upon which date of captivity, he's probably preaching around that time. And also the book of Obadiah, at least as I date it anyway. I think Obadiah is dealing with this destruction in Jerusalem. So those are some things about Daniel. He's an extremely pious and impressive person, obviously, and he's got a lot of things to teach us. Now, I will say this before we get into the book, and that is the best advice I could give you in studying and in preparation for Daniel is to leave Google alone. Because, and I would say probably in a lot of cases, leave YouTube alone. Because the people who are teaching it, the majority of what you're going to see, the way algorithms work, the majority of what you're going to see is something that is premillennial in its nature. And it, with all due respect, it's not even close to being right, okay? We can talk about that maybe in private if you have questions about that, but I don't want to make I don't want to spend all our time trying to unteach what other people have taught wrong. I think our time would be better spent if we just simply taught it the way it's supposed to be understood. And then if we have some questions along the way, we can deal with some of those in private. Maybe we've got Q&A nights, we can address them there. But I think that's going to be the more general approach that we're going to try and take, just because, I mean, we could be here double the time we spent on Kings just dealing with all the ideas that come out of Daniel. So we'll pick up looking at the book itself a little bit more and launch into chapter 1, hopefully next week.